History is often unfair. This is in part understandable, as the way we learn of our past is one which is useful to our present times, and we intentionally neglect anything that we may not find necessary to learn about for our current predicaments in the modern age. After all, it makes sense to have a bias to the history of the country which you grew up in, instead of potentially wasting your time reading about the lore of some far-off place whose stories don't affect you. Yet this sense of history has confined us somewhat, and if we open our perspectives to the broader world, we can find the story of humanity is filled with some of the most amazing and crazy events which often go completely forgotten. And in the middle of the 19th century China, there was a war, so deadly and so horrifying, yet so completely ignored by today's public, that it, in my opinion, tops the list of overlooked events of the past. The Taiping Rebellion was a conflict which went on for 13 years and killed anywhere from 20 to 50 million people, making it the single deadliest war of the 19th century, as well as the deadliest civil war in all of human history. This was all at the behest of a delusional would-be Christian messianic figure who claimed to be the Son of God and the younger brother of Christ himself, a man who led an army of religious fanatics with the intention of turning China into a Christian theocracy. They fought a battle which was in their eyes one of good against evil, one to rid China of its demonic influences. And had they succeeded in this endeavor, one can only imagine the sort of world which we would live in today. But this was no simple fight of good against evil. This was a war which contained some of the most vicious and cruel atrocities ever witnessed, as millions upon millions of innocent lives were taken in some of the most horrifying ways, as no one was spared from the borderline genocidal levels of brutality employed by both sides. In trying to fight the perceived forces of hell, the rebels ended up creating a literal hell on earth, as China was consumed in a conflagration of biblical proportions. For a conflict that killed over 30 million times as many people as the American Civil War, which occurred at around the same time, it is certainly a downright criminally overlooked event. This is their story. The history of China is one of periodic rise and fall, with long periods of peace under a stable and prosperous dynasty, only to collapse violently and be replaced by another long dynasty. This has been occurring ever since the ancient Qing dynasty, founded by the ancient Chinese emperor Qin Shi Huangdi. It fell and was replaced by the Han dynasty, which was then replaced by the Sui, the Tang, the Sung, the Yuan, the Ming, and finally the Qing. Often when the Taiping Rebellion is discussed, there is rarely much mention on the origins of the regime it was trying to overthrow. However, I think it is vital to talk about the late Qing imperial dynasty to fully grasp why things got so ugly, which is why our story starts 200 years earlier in the mid-17th century. Around this time, China was once again undergoing a period of internal chaos and civil strife, with peasant rebels scouring the country and natural disasters killing millions. The ruling Ming dynasty, which had ruled for the past 300 years, had become hopelessly inept and unpopular, losing all ability to govern. This period of anarchy devastated the country, leaving it vulnerable to foreign conquest, and conquest would come in the form of an assortment of recently unified tribes known as the Manchus. The Manchu peoples are a collection of semi-nomadic horsemen tribes mildly related to the Mongols and the Turks, and formerly known as the Jurchen, until they were unified in the mid-1600s by the Aisingoro tribe under the chieftain Nurachi, through a series of alliances and conquests. Nurachi was a highly capable ruler, and it is through his efforts that the Jurchen were not just united under a single cause, but unified as a people permanently, adopting the title of Manchu as their descriptor for their ethnicity. This newly created nation set its eyes south, and under the leadership of Nurachi's successor, Hong XiuQuan, mobilized and attacked the floundering Ming Empire. Being in no condition to defend itself, the Manchurian armies rapidly overran the northern areas of China, capturing Beijing in 1644. They then gradually marched down south, fighting dozens of battles with the Ming. However, lacking confidence and unity, the Manchurians gradually pushed their enemy back, capturing the then capital of China, Nanjing. The Ming were reduced to small pockets of resistance, which were eventually crushed. In an imitation of the former rulers of China, the Manchu conquerors named their new empire the Qing dynasty, based their capital in Beijing, and would rule in a similar manner and structure as the previous imperial regimes for the next 250 years. However, whilst this may have been the case, Manchurians had a remarkably distinct culture from the local ethnic Han Chinese, as their language is quite different, their food and dress are alien, and by far the most prescient difference is their unique hairstyle, which is in the form of a long braid known as a queue. This hairstyle has a tendency to be associated with everything traditionally Chinese, yet it is anything but. All Chinese men from any ethnicity were required to wear this, and in a country which was ostensibly under foreign occupation for the better part of 3 centuries, it became a very common symbol of Manchu oppression. In the era of the Taiping, the removal of the queue and the sporting of long and unbound hair became central to their identity, as well as that of many other rebel groups. This is why the rebels would come to be known as long hairs, loyalists who sported the queue as short hairs, as we shall see later. The reign of the Qing Empire got off to a fairly good start under Xuanyi, who ascended as Emperor Kangxi, the longest reigning monarch in Chinese history, and arguably one of its greatest, having been known to be competent, wise, and benevolent. China in the early 18th century was able to make a recovery from the recent wars and experienced a renaissance in art and in literature, a boom in trade, and its territory grew to the greatest size it had ever in history, subduing the barbarian tribes in Mongolia and Central Asia. The increase in wealth allowed the population to triple within less than 200 years, from 150 million to 450 million. Indeed, despite being foreign occupiers, the Manchu were, at least at the beginning, good stewards of Chinese society, so much so that many of them gradually gave up their heritage and became integrated into the larger culture. They were also quite open to West and its ideas, as Kangxi kept several Portuguese Jesuit scholars in his court and was receptive and friendly to them. The Qing dynasty was, for a brief period, probably the most powerful empire on the planet. Yet as with all imperial golden ages, it did not last. Emperor Kangxi was succeeded by some less than desirable heirs. The first of these was Yin Shen, his imperial name Yongzhen, a strict and conservative authoritarian who centralized imperial control and killed many political dissidents with impunity, far from the tolerant benevolence of his father. Yet the real decline, in my opinion, began with the ascension of his son, Hong Li, better known as the Qianlong Emperor. Qianlong has gone down as a controversial figure in Chinese history. On the one hand, he was kind and generous, a patron of the arts, spent lavishly amongst his subjects, and lowered taxation. However, this was also his main fault, the fact that he was unbelievably reckless with expenditures. Qianlong spent an enormous amount of silver on a variety of vanity projects, including monuments, palaces, and other luxuries. During his time, the officials and civil service became obscenely corrupt, as Qianlong's generosity encouraged blatant embezzlement, which he did little to stop. This was all whilst he engaged in disastrous military adventurism. The 10 Great Campaigns, as they have come to be known, were a series of aggressive wars fought against China's neighbours. Yet, despite their name, most of these were costly disasters which achieved little other than the immoral Dzungar genocide, where the Chinese imperial forces brutally wiped out 80% of a Turkic tribe in Central Asia, an atrocity that has almost been completely forgotten about. Upon Qianlong's leaving the throne in 1796, the empire's financial situation was in a precarious state, and it was with him that the first cracks within the framework began to form. From this point, the Qing dynasty had nowhere to go but downhill. Future rulers did make an attempt to undo the damage done, yet to little avail. Qianlong's son and successor, Yongyang, under the imperial title of Jiaqing, tried to dismiss as many corrupt officials as possible and curb spending, but by then it was too little, too late. China was suffering from rapid inflation, and the central authorities were losing the ability to handle it. Several uprisings occurred, such as the White Lotus Rebellion, and there was an economic recession in the 1840s. Quote, "Throughout most periods of imperial history prior to the 19th century, increased population density per unit of land had led to higher rather than lower food yields, since labor, not land, was almost always in relatively short supply. Having more laborers allowed for more intensive farming, expansion and maintenance of irrigation systems, and better fertilization, which increased amounts of human excrement. By around the turn of the century, however, the cost-benefit ratio reversed, and further growth of population relative to agrarian land led to a reduction in the general standard of living." What William Rowe is essentially describing is what academics have dubbed a secular cycle, that being that societies will experience a considerable economic growth when there is enough space for their population to grow, yet will become bloated and unsustainable once the limits of such expansion are reached, as workers will find it increasingly difficult to secure employment and therefore have to submit to lower wages, which impoverishes them. This is all whilst the landowning elites continue to profit from the excess labor and wealth inequality starts to rise. This is the source of substantial resentment against the establishment by the lower classes, creating political instability. Because of this, a sinister phenomenon was taking place, the age-old Chinese practice of female infanticide. The killing of baby girls goes back centuries, and it stems from China's highly patriarchal society. Chinese women have historically enjoyed no rights to speak of and were ostensibly treated as furniture to be passed around as familial bargaining chips. The practice of foot binding was extremely common in this period, whereby a woman's feet were crushed to be extremely small, which was seen as a sign of privilege. Women could never inherit their family's wealth or titles, hence why male children were preferred, and once Chinese families became poorer, they chose to be more selective with their offspring, which meant that in many cases the females had to go. Baby girls were drowned, buried alive, or simply tossed onto rubbish heaps. This sickening and outright disturbing practice is still a reality in China today. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, the consequence of so many baby girls being murdered was the creation of a severe gender imbalance. In Chinese culture, men are under a lot of pressure to get married, and when there is a shortage of women, this became impossible for many of them to accomplish. Compounding this issue was the fact that the upper Chinese classes were rather polygamous, as wealthy patriarchs had a habit of accumulating large harems of concubines, exacerbating the shortage of females. With millions of men unable to get laid no matter how hard they tried, the incentive to turn to violent means to change the status quo greatly increased. Interestingly, one of the components of Taiping ideology was absolute gender equality, as we will see soon. However, arguably the most influential factor in birthing the Taiping was a mistake made in previous years with representatives of a small island a world away that would come to be the nemesis of Chinese civilization. The British Empire at the time was in a period of aggressive expansion all over the world. After winning the Napoleonic Wars, Britain had become the preeminent European superpower, and thanks to unmatched prowess in naval technology, grew to acquire a dominion that spanned the globe, and a market that they had always sought to acquire was China, as the place was believed by Westerners to have a magnificent wealth and prosperity, one which they were eager to trade with. Now, Chinese attitudes towards foreigners and their methods at this time were complex. However, among the elites it was typically one of condescension, and in the waning years of the Qing, Westerners came to be seen as barbarians with little to offer. Their concept of markets and capitalism was found to be novel and confusing to the elites, who saw it as a threat to social harmony. Foreign traders in port cities had to adhere to a rigid commercial regulations and could never venture into China beyond the coast, deeply frustrating them. This was all whilst the British had acquired an addiction to Chinese tea and sought to do whatever they could to get more. This led to them using shadier means. Britain at the time owned vast cultivation fields in India, and its merchants decided to put them to good use growing poppy seeds that could then be processed into opium. Opium is a highly addictive drug that, once inhaled, produces a state of unparalleled dreamlike ecstasy, similar to the effects of heroin. The British used a vast network of smuggling to get the substance into China, which became an enormously profitable business, so much so that they were able to make up their deficit in silver and could now purchase tea more easily. This was, of course, to the great detriment of the Chinese people, whose health was ruined. As historian Frank Sanello in Opium Wars writes, quote, "This expensive pastime of the idle gradually made its way down the socio-economic ladder. Shopkeepers, soldiers, servants, and even Taoist priests were looking at opium pipes and drifting off into week-long escapes from productivity, responsibility, and consciousness. China's powerful elite were not blind to the mess that the foreign import had caused. One quarter estimated that 4 million Chinese were habituated. A British doctor in Canton suspected that the figure was 3 times that. The economy, government services, and standard of living all declined because of substance abuse." Rightfully angered, the Chinese state led a crackdown against the opium trade and seized a massive amount of British assets. However, fed up with China's refusal to trade on equal terms, and after a complex series of slights and diplomatic misunderstandings, the British decided to use this seizure as a cause for war, and in 1839, the First Opium War began. As early as the 18th century, the gap between Chinese and European technology was quite evident. Many centuries of conservatism within China had been a barrier to progress, and Britain was now centuries ahead in terms of technological capability. China displayed a remarkable level of dismissal towards this reality, the most infamous case of this being the Macartney expedition of 1793, where the Chinese said that the British had nothing to offer them. Such arrogance ended up having catastrophic consequences. What followed was one of the most one-sided wars in human history. British naval prowess was such that despite being an island only 1/10 the size and a continent away, they were able to completely blow away the Chinese forces while suffering infinitesimally small losses, at times with casualty rates of 100 to 1. The war ended in 1842 with the complete annihilation of the Chinese Navy and the capture of dozens of its coastal cities, forcing them to sign the Treaty of Nanking, a humiliating document which included the payment of an exorbitant reparations fee and an unfettered access to Chinese ports, which would only make it easier for opium to be smuggled, further poisoning China. The First Opium War completely changed the course of Chinese civilization. Whilst China had been conquered by nomadic horsemen in the past, nothing like this had ever happened in its history. Yet despite its novelty, the Treaty of Nanking could only be the first of many humiliating, one-sided treaties forced on China. This was the beginning of what Chinese historians have dubbed as the Century of Humiliation, an age where the country would suffer constant manipulation and defeat by foreign powers. The empire was now facing an extreme level of discontent from all society, discontent that would be laid now on the highly unpopular Manchu rulers. With China now open to the world, a whole variety of foreign ideas poured in, with one of the most crucial being the religion of Christianity. Now, this religion was by no means new in China. It is often forgotten that there were Christian communities in this land as far back as the 7th century, as travelers from the Middle East made their way to spread the gospel. There's even a Christian stele that was erected in 781 by Nestorians during the Tang dynasty, which still survives to this day. Further on, the Catholic group known as the Jesuits had made their way into China and curried favor with the emperors, and are reported to have been on very good terms. But now, preachers were flowing into the land on an unprecedented scale, especially Protestant missionaries from Britain and later on the United States. Chinese attitudes were mixed. Most looked at these missionaries as propagators of a foreign culture that was trying to impose its will on theirs, a view which was not without justification. The missionaries often had a difficult time learning the local language, and on many occasions resorted to using interpreters, which increased the probability for misunderstandings. This wasn't helped by their condescending attitudes towards local Chinese religions, such as Buddhism, which they labeled as satanic and evil, as well as describing many Chinese traditions as backwards and uncivilized. Nonetheless, the resentment towards the current state of affairs led many local Chinese to look at Western culture and traditions with a real sense of curiosity, and one man in particular came to embody this. Hong XiuQuan, later known as XiuQuan, was an aspiring academic who studied almost all of his life to pass the Chinese civil service examinations. These examinations were essentially a government program which had existed in China for centuries, open to any individual regardless of their social standing. It focused on subjects of Chinese classics such as Confucian philosophy, and if one managed to pass, they would be allowed into the highly prestigious Chinese bureaucracy, which guaranteed a highly luxurious and honored career both for oneself and the extended family. Early on in his life, XiuQuan had a promising future, as he was highly talented and excelled in history and literature. His family and tutors noticed, and believing that this could be their chance to gain a higher status for the clan, decided to invest heavily in him and give him the best education that they could. Unfortunately, when Hong XiuQuan traveled to the province of Canton in 1827 to take it, he found just how extraordinarily difficult this examination was and failed. 9 years later, he took the exam again, only to face the same results. A year later, he took the test a third time and failed once more. It's worth realizing just how much pressure XiuQuan was under, as his entire family was invested into his success, and him failing was considered an utter disgrace. With the nerves pushed to the limit, he suffered a nervous breakdown and faded into a coma for 40 days. Whilst asleep, he experienced a bizarre vision, one where he was taken to a beautiful and luminous place where he met a golden-bearded man on a throne. The man wept and said to XiuQuan that the people of the land did not venerate him, and they were choosing to worship demons instead. He then presented XiuQuan with a great sword, telling him to slay these demons. Afterwards, he was transported back to Earth by heavenly beasts, where he would awake. When Hong XiuQuan awoke, he was said to have felt reinvigorated and no longer dwelling on his failures. It was akin, as he said, to feeling reborn. However, it does seem like he must have shrugged off the vision as he went back to living an ordinary life. It was during this time that Hong must have come across a Christian preacher. Exactly who this preacher was is to this day unclear. Yet during his encounter, Hong was given a Christian tract in Chinese, which he kept on his shelf for some time without opening it. Years later, he took the civil service exam one last time, and failed once more. Yet instead of despairing, he rediscovered the book on his shelf and read it. It was here where his journey began. Hong XiuQuan became utterly convinced that the visions he experienced had much more to do with this booklet. After all, his dream was very reminiscent of some biblical revelations, such as in the book of Ezekiel, or the book of Revelation, to be said. He felt like everything made sense now, and he came to the extreme conclusion that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ himself and the Son of God, brought on this earth to spread the word of the Lord. XiuQuan became a true fanatical Christian believer, baptized himself, and set about to gather as many Christian texts as he could find. He got rid of all the Taoist, Confucian, and Buddhist artifacts around him, as he now deemed them to be sinful. He also began to preach to his community about his beliefs. However, he was not initially successful, and people rightfully ousted him as insane. I guess telling your own father that he was cuckolded by God himself isn't going to go down well, although we're not entirely clear as to how this went down. Yet, like with all cults, growth has to be gradual. It is worth mentioning that Hong and his community were a member of the Hakka people. The Hakka are a minority group in China who mainly reside in the southern provinces of Guangdong and Guangxi. They are not a minority because of ethnicity, but because of their status as internal migrants who in the past fled wars and conflicts from the north, such as the Manchu invasions. However, when they settled in the new regions, they were often discriminated against and effectively treated as second-class citizens. The name Hakka literally means guest people in Cantonese, and over the years they had grown increasingly resentful of society and would be among the first to join a radical movement if there ever was one. XiuQuan continued preaching and slowly started to accumulate followers. This began with several of his close neighbors, which slowly but surely spread the word to other communities. One crucial individual was Fen Funshan, an early convert who tirelessly traveled from village to village, exploiting local resentment and obtaining hundreds of converts. This cult became known as the Society of the God Worshippers, and its growth continued exponentially, as Stephen Platt writes. Quote, by 1847, there were about 2,000 followers of the society, primarily from the Hakka population. Emboldened by their faith and their numbers, they began smashing Buddhist idols and temples, raising the suspicion of the authorities. By 1849, the independent congregations were having fits, speaking in tongues. They looked to Hong XiuQuan to tell them which of their channeled words came from God and which came from the devil. A pestilence ravaged the province in 1850, and when word spread that sick people could be healed by praying to Hong XiuQuan's God, the numbers exploded. Multitudes joined the religion and the society, and after a disease had passed, they gave credit of their survival to Hong's new religion. Unquote. The version of Christianity they preached was incredibly puritanical and one of the most bizarre in history. To begin with, Hong demanded he be treated with godlike status and that he be referred to as godly, something which most other Christians would find heretical. Extreme rules were implemented in accordance with morality, which included the forbiddance of all sexual intercourse, even for married couples. Advocacy was made for the abolition of private property and redistribution of wealth, and all vestiges of Chinese culture were vilified and destroyed, as the god worshippers saw themselves as creating a whole new civilization. The Taiping often get compared to the Puritans, an extreme Christian sect which attempts to implement the strictest biblical interpretations for daily life. Yet I think they are more comparable to the American Mormons, who took elements of Christianity and created an entirely separate religion. This is mainly because the Taiping cult had a lack of authentic Christian scriptures and chose to fabricate a number of manuscripts. Indeed, the Taiping version of the Bible is criticized for being very different to the standard version. At first, their movement was completely peaceful. However, as the authorities of the Qing Empire took notice, they started to harass and threaten them, which compelled the society to adopt measures of self-defense. The spark came when Hong got word that Qing officials had been sent to arrest him and reacted to the threat by arming his followers, who were now numbering in the tens of thousands. They easily swatted the expedition. By signing Hong's arrest warrant, the Qing Empire had effectively declared war on the god worshippers, and in that moment, XiuQuan decided to found the Taiping Rebellion, meaning Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. A rather ironic name, as this kingdom would be in a state of total war for 100% of its existence. At this stage, Chinese society was reaching a critical boiling point. Decades of corrupt and inept leadership had left the masses impoverished. Millions of men were frustrated at their prospects, and humiliation by foreign powers had destroyed any faith in the regime's ability to defend itself. The commoners were angry and fed up with current affairs, and with the Heavenly Kingdom having just defeated an entire imperial regimen, there was no turning back. Civil war had come. Yong'an was the first city to fall to the rebels, captured in September of 1851. The local garrison had been caught completely off guard, and little resistance was given. The Heavenly Kingdom was now on the offensive, and steadily gathering momentum. The message of the Taiping morphed from one of religion into one of politics, as they capitalized on Chinese resentment against the Qing dynasty and the Manchu. This was highly successful advertisement, as hundreds of thousands of Chinese peasants began to join the rebellion in areas they moved into. This would have the consequence of instigating a genocide against Manchu settlers. More on that later. The Qing imperial forces mobilized to defeat this rapidly evolving threat in its nascency, yet struggled to contain it. The Heavenly Kingdom was expanding rapidly, capturing dozens of towns and villages in the southern provinces of Hunan and Guangxi. The only thing that slowed down the rebels were the local militias hastily put together by regional warlords who did not want their homes absorbed by a bunch of religious fanatics. These warlords fought fiercely to keep the rebellion at bay, which they were able to do with a degree of success. The Taiping were forced out of Yongan during a ferocious attack by loyalists, and their offensive southwards was repelled, with tens of thousands of god-worshippers being killed during their siege of Changsha, the major city in the province of Guangxi. The loyalist warlords went on the offensive, brutally cutting down the rebels who were in a full-scale retreat in some areas. For a brief moment, it seemed like the rebellion would be snuffed out in its infancy. However, Hong decided to abandon the south and turn eastwards towards major cities, and for every setback they suffered, many more victories were gained. The eastward march was enabled by the capture of sailing vessels, which were incorporated into the growing Taiping Navy and allowed them to travel down the rivers. The Chinese river system is like a transport highway, and having control of it is crucial if you want to take the country by force. With this advantage, the rebels were able to conquer city after city in 1852, putting millions of people under their control. At this stage, the Heavenly Kingdom was like a snowball which just kept on gaining more inertia. The Taiping army was undergoing a substantial evolution. The rebel fighters began mostly as a highly mobile force operating in small regiments, rather akin to a guerrilla army. Initially, most of these fighters were recruited from the rejects of society, such as criminals and social minorities like the Hakka. Yet soon, Chinese men of all stripes started to join by the hundreds of thousands and eventually the millions. A simple guerrilla army was no longer viable and conventional warfare had to be adopted. The rebels were more than capable of adapting to this. Taiping officials began to implement conscription programs wherever they went, sometimes peacefully asking people to join, and other times forcefully dragging them into the ranks. These recruits underwent a vigorous program of indoctrination and then sent to a tough boot camp, becoming trained to fight. Women also made up a part of the army, as Hong XiuQuan had declared absolute equality between the sexes. These female fighters worked in segregated battalions and were reportedly rather effective, with Hong XiuQuan becoming a prominent and influential female general. In some ways, the rebel army became similar to that of an ordinary state, functioning with its own bureaucracy and stratification from general to officer. They even created a war economy dedicated to fabricating weapons and equipment such as spears and firearms. Through these implementations, the Taiping became an organized and disciplined fighting force more than capable of defeating the massive Qing armies they would soon face. It is not clear exactly how large the Taiping army came to be, but some sources suggest it numbered as high as 500,000, whilst others say it reached the size of 2 million. To put that into perspective, that's larger than the army of France during World War I. When it came to leadership, the Taiping had some surprisingly competent heads. The most famous was General Shi Dakai, a Hakka village boy who joined the rebels at the age of 16. Despite his youth, he was able to demonstrate an unusual talent in battle and led troops to victory even against difficult odds. Cheng Yuncheng was another talented leader with a similar background who loyally served the Taiping cause for the whole duration of the conflict. This is not to mention all the partisans, spies, and other special operatives which were employed. Many areas which were never touched by the rebel armies still had to deal with the infiltration and acts of terror committed by sympathizers to the Taiping cause. In some ways, the Heavenly Kingdom was similar to the modern Islamic fundamentalist groups such as the Islamic State or Boko Haram, terrorist insurgencies who used a combination of conventional fighting forces along with partisan cells to create a theocratic state. The rebels were now steadily making their way from the south of China to the eastern provinces along the coast. The Eastern Campaign was a spectacular success and involved many feats of masterful organization and strategic planning. To begin with, the hastily put together Taiping Navy was able to cruise up the Yangtze River and aid the rebels in making bold advances. The rebels were able to completely surround the great river city of Wuchang by capturing all surrounding settlements and attacking it from the weak angle. Despite being heavily defended, Wuchang surrendered without much of a fight. Pressing the advantage, the Taiping continued to swiftly march more than 1,000 kilometers towards what would be their greatest prize, the city of Nanjing, also known as Nanking. Nanjing is the historical capital of China, being the main administrative location of the Ming dynasty that ruled before the Qing, which meant capturing it may not be a fatal blow to the empire, but it would be a major win for the rebels nonetheless. Whilst the city was heavily guarded and had impressive defences which included walls that were over 10 meters tall, this was no obstacle to the rebels, who made good use of spies and infiltration into the city for both reconnaissance and sabotage. It is worth noting that the Taiping excelled in propaganda, as sympathizers to their cause often distributed their messages of anti-Manchu sentiment and displeasure against the ruling dynasty to gain even more sympathizers, who could then form a fifth column behind enemy lines and dismantle resistance. This occurred all throughout China. By March of 1853, Nanjing was surrounded, and the rebels began a ferocious assault on the city. The local garrison, whilst numbering as high as 50,000, was demoralized, inexperienced, and most of them were Manchu, which meant that they were despised and distrusted by the very people they were supposed to defend. Their defense rapidly crumbled, and the rebels were able to get through to the walls and onto the streets. After some bitter fighting, the garrison surrendered by the end of March. Hong XiuQuan decided to make Nanjing his main prize and renamed the city Tianjin, meaning heavenly capital. He entered the city on a massive procession, carried on a large golden palanquin and flanked by female cavaliers. Tianjin would become the main base of operations for the rebels, and Hong's home for the remainder of the war. Whilst this occurred, a brutal atrocity was carried out against the surviving Manchu population. For a while, the Taiping had labelled the Manchu as literal demons who were the born agents of Satan, blaming them for all of China's woes. During the earlier years of the Qing dynasty, a substantial number of Manchus had migrated from the north to the south, where they had integrated with the local population. However, when the Heavenly Kingdom took control of these areas, their lives were cut short. All Manchu males in Nanjing were taken and savagely butchered in the streets. Afterwards, the women and children were rounded up, gathered onto a pyre, and burnt alive. The rebels killed hundreds of thousands, as such massacres were repeated whenever they entered a new area, effectively becoming a genocide. As the war dragged on, any shred of morality and decency was thrown out the window by both sides. The Taiping didn't just conduct a mass murder of Manchus, but also butchered members of China's traditional faiths, such as Taoists and Buddhists, whilst looting and destroying their temples. Mass killings were also directed against the Hui Muslim Chinese and, strangely enough, other Chinese Christian converts who denounced the Taiping as heretics. When fighting the rebellion, government officials and warlords enacted purges on their own people to root out suspected Taiping sympathizers on an unbelievable scale. Hundreds of thousands of individuals who seemed even remotely suspicious were killed indiscriminately, often with brutal means such as dismemberment, beheading, or tortured before being tied up and thrown in the river, some of which ended up being filled with so many corpses they became contaminated and undrinkable. One notorious incident was the Canton Purge of 1854, where the local governor boasted of executing 100,000 people. On the front, a policy of scorched earth was the norm for both sides, as armies sought to deprive their enemies of food by setting fire to the fields and looting anything left of value from the peasants. This strategy had disastrous consequences, as it caused famines which killed countless millions. Most victims of this cruel civil war died as a result of the famine and disease, and wherever the Taiping went was turned into a living hell. It is also worth mentioning the massive amount of displacement that occurred. Every war, especially civil wars, create a refugee crisis, and this conflict was no different. Endless columns of Chinese civilians were forced to flee their homes to escape the violence met upon them, often having to seek refuge in sprawling camps or slums in cities, often in unbelievably inhumane conditions. Exactly how many refugees this war created is impossible to extract, yet this number could be as high as 100 million. Some of these refugees sought to emigrate to the United States, becoming the first generation of Chinese Americans. Zhang Daye writes, "They, the rebels, burned the trees of the Song mausoleums. Billowing smoke covered the sky. On that day, just at daybreak, there was a sudden thunderstorm, with violent wind and pouring rain. Hundreds of refugees were flushed down the mountain flood and broke their limbs. Villagers fled in panic, and screams shook the sky. My mother and I stumbled into the woods, thinking we would surely die. But then Sanyi and his mother, both in tears, rushed there and found us, and we escaped together. Numerous people died during this attack. In some cases, entire families were killed." The World of a Tiny Insect is the personal memoir of Zhang Daye, a young survivor of this mess. It provides a window into the lives of those who were caught within the extreme violence which inundated China, and is a read I personally recommend. If there was ever a moment when it seemed like the rebels would fully conquer China, mid-1853 was the time. The capture of Nanjing was a critical blow to the Qing dynasty, and the Taiping snowball had now gathered enough inertia to become an avalanche, as they had now amassed a massive amount of weapons, supplies, and gunpowder. Wasting no time, Hong XiuQuan now posed the ultimate threat to the Qing dynasty, sending 2 large expeditions to conquer the rest of China, with one heading westwards, but more crucially, one heading north, straight to the capital of Beijing. Up to 100,000 veteran troops were dispatched in the northern expedition. At first, things went well, as the army cruised up the Yangtze River, taking even more towns and cities. The situation was looking bad enough that the officials at Beijing seriously considered evacuating before it was too late. But despite the seemingly inexorable advance, a number of unexpected setbacks came into play when things seemed hopeless. First of all, the rebels, who were mostly from southern China, were now in unfamiliar territory, in a climate they had not adapted to, and their fighting prowess was greatly reduced as a result. Meanwhile, the Qing dynasty, which was in a state of desperation, had mobilized to meet the advance. The Taiping took heavy losses against elite Mongol cavalry archers and crack squads of Manchus. They spent precious time besieging several cities with little strategic importance, wasting lives and resources. Then the winter came, and in northern China, winters can be deadly. The rebels had failed to prepare for such weather, and their advance was halted. Seizing this opportunity, the loyalist forces made an encircling maneuver around the bulk of their enemy forces, and by February of 1854 had completely surrounded them. They had come within only 5 kilometers of Beijing. Meanwhile, the Western campaign, which sought to recapture cities that had been lost by the Heavenly Kingdom, had made inroads, yet it encountered its own difficulties. The local warlords had become wise to the rebels' tactics and were fiercely defending their turf from the enemy. The campaign stalled and devolved into a steady back and forth, and the rebels lost tens of thousands in a vicious and unproductive war of attrition. Up north, the rebel army that was now encircled was gradually chipped away at and destroyed by the loyalists. Despite the momentum they had, both campaigns failed to achieve their aims, and the Taiping avalanche was withstood, and the empire was saved. Yet whilst total defeat had been averted, the war was still far from won. The Heavenly Kingdom was in control of an area of land about the size of France, and there was still a decade of fighting left. The Qing dynasty had avoided a sudden end, yet now it needed to generate a unified fighting force to fully extinguish the Heavenly Kingdom, a force which it could only barely manage to come up with. The main army which the imperial dynasty relied upon was the so-called Green Standard Army. This was one of 8 armies formed during the early days of the Manchu conquests of China, and functioned effectively as a police force, as dealing with rebellions was its main use. Once an efficient and well-led group, this army had become a highly corrupt and incapable over the years, as its leaders were inexperienced and its troops were mostly unwilling conscripts whose training and weapons were sorely lacking. Most of the victories that it would end up achieving would be purely through a superiority in numbers, as it fielded around 600,000 to 1,000,000 troops. Most of the resistance towards the Taiping did not come from the Qing government itself, but through local resistance. Now the rebels, despite their populist rhetoric, which was able to resonate amongst the impoverished masses, did not find favour with most of the country. Many saw them as crazed cultists who had no business enforcing their foreign beliefs on them. It also did not help the Taiping made land expropriation and redistribution one of their priorities. More on that later. Local warlords and popular militias from the very beginning of the conflict were formed all around the country and gave the manpower that was needed to save the ruling dynasty. The most famous of these was the Hunan army, which was created by the statesman Zhang Daye, a disciplined but harsh man who years before had ascended to the bureaucracy by passing the civil service examination, unlike Hong XiuQuan. Using funds from local governors and a campaign of door-to-door recruitment, Daye was able to raise a force of 100,000 relatively quickly, and was able to give the rebels a severe thrashing in several campaigns. Daye became known for his strategic prowess, but also for his ruthlessness, as he ordered his troops to destroy entire settlements to weed out rebels. Several other armies, such as the Anhui army, mimicked this model. One of the most interesting forces to fight for the Qing was the so-called ever-victorious army formed by the American sailor Frederick Townsend Ward. This was an army composed mainly of local Chinese fighters, but led with modern tactics and equipment brought from Western nations. Formed in later years of the war thanks to foreign investment, Ward was able to create a force of around 5,000. Despite their lack of numbers, they were able to inflict severe casualties on their enemy thanks to their superior techniques. In many ways, they would go on to become the basis of China's modern armies. Yet, overall resistance to the rebels was clumsy and lacked coordination. After 1854, the war shifted into a back-and-forth slogging match, with both sides launching vicious attacks, but neither able to gather the advantage needed to win. A constant shifting of the front lines took place, with some areas, such as the town of Wuhu, changing hands 8 times in 2 years. This went on for the better part of a decade, with hundreds of battles being fought, way too many of them to be listed. There is an interesting video by the YouTuber Yang Xishang, which shows a time-lapse of the Taiping Rebellion every day. If you wish to know what I mean by endless back and forth, I suggest you watch it, link in the description. As the conflict went on, the current state of the rest of China was a complete and utter mess. The Taiping Rebellion, whilst the biggest, was not the only rebellion being fought in that moment. Just to the north was the Nian Rebellion, led by the agitator Zhang Daye, and using the memorable catchphrase, "Kill the rich and aid the poor." They ended up killing hundreds of thousands and at times coordinated with the Taipings in their efforts, although little came of this loose alliance. Down south there was the Panthay Rebellion, another religious uprising led by the Muslim Chinese known as the Hui. The Hui Muslims are ethnically Han Chinese whose ancestors had converted to Islam in the 8th century during the Tang dynasty, but had regularly been the victims of discrimination and repression. In a bout of anger, many of them decided to take up arms in 1857 and ended up killing up to 1 million. Similar uprisings included the Miao Rebellion further south and the Dogon Rebellion in the west, both of which were led by ethnic minorities who had unenviable positions in society. Chinese leadership during these trying times left much to be desired. Emperor Yi Zhu, ruling under the title of Xiangfeng, was weak and utterly disconnected from his responsibilities. He had instead taken to dallying with prostitutes and brothels and ended up contracting a veritable concoction of sexually transmitted diseases. He is even rumoured to have himself been addicted to the very opium brought from British smugglers. Whether or not this is true, he ended up dying in his 30s from bad health. Just when it seemed things couldn't get any worse, they did. The Second Opium War, also known as the Arrow War, began in 1858 when Chinese authorities seized a vessel that was flying the British flag, the Union Jack. This offence was a perfect opportunity to further open China, and a British and French coalition launched an attack into the north, demanding further concessions. This war had a similar result to the first, a quick, one-sided affair which saw the Chinese suffer against a military might of the Western empires, who took almost no casualties when they assaulted inland. This culminated with the seizure and destruction of the Qing summer palace. With no other option, Emperor Xiang Feng sued for peace and agreed to pay yet another crushing indemnity, and signed the Convention of Peking, which ceded Chinese territory to the British, of which would include the famous island of Hong Kong. China continued to be crippled by widespread opium addiction, which was becoming more of a problem than ever. Chinese financial reserves were in a pitiful state, as almost all silver had been squandered, leaving the central government broke. Obtaining more silver was impossible because they were at a trading deficit with Britain, but also because the whole system of tax collection was in total chaos. It's honestly a miracle that the Qing dynasty was able to survive this period at all. However, it seems that a combination of luck and lethargy from the Taiping rebels allowed the imperial government to hang on by a thread. As the years passed, the society of the Heavenly Kingdom consolidated itself into a strange place as Hong XiuQuan implemented some of the most draconian and puritanical laws on the people under his rule. The most striking is a complete ban on all contact between the sexes, even for married couples. This arose from a mistranslation of the seventh commandment, which states, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." The Taiping took this a little too far, it seems. Yet they were still able to reproduce, as the law was often flouted and not strictly enforced. Private property was abolished, and any and all landholdings or possessions were taken and redistributed amongst the people in a strange form of proto-communism. This, however, generated a lot of resentment, as the possessions of previously wealthy families were taken and granted to those who were seen as too lazy to have acquired it otherwise. It did not help that the system was prone to large levels of abuse and corruption by officials, who used the policy to accumulate large sums of land for themselves. The Heavenly Kingdom had gradually become a pseudo-communist, totalitarian, theocratic police state, which was arguably far worse than the regime it sought to replace, and the Chinese people living under them grew to have a very negative opinion of them. That being said, it was quite progressive when it came to women. The Taiping outlawed the archaic practice of foot binding and did what they could to abolish female infanticide. Women officially enjoyed legal status to men on every level, although exactly how much that equality was followed is unclear. What is clear is Hong XiuQuan's overwhelming hypocrisy in his private life. He became secluded in his palace in Tianjin, where he enjoyed incredible luxuries. His own puritanical edicts did not stop him from accumulating a harem of what is believed to be 68 wives and fathered untold numbers of children. Hong became ever more private and disconnected from the outside world, rarely making public appearances, instead choosing to dally in his affairs. As he was secluded, political intrigue began to brew in the Heavenly Kingdom. XiuQuan had divided his political authority amongst a number of kings who served under him. These included the Northern King, the Eastern King, the Southern King, the Western King, and finally the Wing King. The Eastern King, Yang Xiaoqing, was of particular importance, as he was designated by Hong as the Speaker of God. Yang had been with Hong since the very beginning of the rebellion, becoming a loyal and trusted follower. However, he had his own ambitions. Yang would periodically fall asleep and wake up to voice commands he claimed to have heard from God himself. Over time, as Hong remained distracted, he slowly began to accrue more influence, and started to make subtle claims over Hong XiuQuan's legitimacy. He ended up practically running the city and instituting a reign of terror, killing thousands of suspected heretics and blasphemers. In 1856, Yang staged a palace coup against Hong, hoping to acquire the title of leader of the Heavenly Kingdom for himself. But Hong was able to gain wind of the plot and sent his loyal generals to kill him. They successfully stormed his residence and massacred both Yang and 6,000 of his followers. This conspicuous event became known as the Tianjin Incident. The world outside of China was starting to gain a perspective on the conflict, especially in the West. It is worth noting that the rebels purchased a considerable amount from Western nations, especially when it came to guns and ammunition, much of which flowed to the port city of Anqing, which was under rebel control. This trade had become vital to them during the war, and is what generated much of the attention towards them. It is worth knowing that Europe had recently undergone its own upheavals in 1848, and there was some who interpreted this rebellion as having a remarkable parallel. The famous economist and philosopher Karl Marx had many things to say on it. In the New York Daily Tribune he wrote, quote, "The next uprising of the people of Europe, and their next movement for republican freedom and economy of government, may depend more probably on what is now passing in the Celestial Empire, the very opposite of Europe, that on another political cause that now exists." Marx was convinced that British disruption in China's old order and the opening of the country to the world had triggered a revolutionary consciousness within the people, who were now on the forefront of a socialist uprising. As time went on and he learned more, however, he eventually grew disillusioned with them. Even more interestingly, American Southern slave owners came to the belief that this was a racial uprising in a foreign slave state. They concluded that the Manchus were a pristine and civilized people who had dominated the inferior and backward Han Chinese. This, they saw, was an upset to what was meant to be the natural hierarchy in China, and something which deeply concerned them as it was a threat to the natural order in their own lands. Many amongst the British elites believed that this was a chance to obtain a more favourable government in China. Decades of having to deal with the stubborn Qing had given them hopes that a new regime that was Christian would be more open to trade and negotiation. Similarly, many Christian missionaries saw a sign of hope in the rebels, as a Christian China would be one of the ultimate culminations of their hard work. However, both these groups became disappointed when they learned just how insane Hong XiuQuan and his followers were. Many visitors to the Heavenly Kingdom to see XiuQuan and the work he had accomplished for themselves, but were disgusted by the level of debauchery he engaged in, as well as how the Christian faith had been perverted to engage in barbaric violence. Because of this, whilst European traders may have hated the current imperial dynasty, they erred on the side of caution and chose neutrality over anything else for the time being, looking on the sidelines from the ports. However, this all changed when the rebels made their last catastrophic mistake. With seemingly no end in sight, the rebels sought to end the war with a bold but risky move, an attack on the port city of Shanghai. They reasoned that if they managed to capture this rich city, they would be able to acquire enough resources and wealth to purchase modern steamships from foreigners and turn the tide of war. This plan had an evident danger, however, as Shanghai was an important trading hub for the British, and bringing the war to it may turn them against the Heavenly Kingdom. Seeing no other way to win the war, however, the Taiping opted for the plan. In 1860, the rebels decided to launch an eastern offensive. At first, things devolved into vicious fighting along the Yangtze River. For about a year, attackers slogged it out with the loyalist forces. However, their commander, Li Xiuzheng, was able to outmaneuver the loyalists and by mid-1861 leave them completely defeated. Now, nothing stood between the city and an army of 100,000. For a moment, it seemed like Shanghai would fall. The local defending garrison was hopelessly outnumbered by the rebels, who had now surrounded the peninsula upon which the city was located, capturing the surrounding settlements and cutting off aid from the rest of China. Xiuzheng demanded surrender, promising that no harm would come to any who cooperated with him. However, the city stubbornly refused, and seeing no other option, Xiuzheng decided to launch the attack in February of 1862. Yet, just as everything seemed utterly lost, the weather, like in 1853, seemed to have its own agenda. An unusually harsh winter came that month. The Yangtze River froze, and the rebel ships were stuck in place whilst many of their troops died of frostbite. They soon met resistance from another unexpected foe, the so-called ever-victorious army under Frederick Townsend Ward. Ward, with his newly trained Chinese troops, led a ferocious counterattack which inflicted significant casualties on their enemy. This was alongside newly received British support from the city's defences, who decisively saved Shanghai. In early 1862, the Taiping were forced to retreat. Not only did the rebels lose a large number of troops, they had more importantly lost all Western support, who now saw them as a threat to their interests. The British, French and Americans had made up their minds and decided that now was the time to end the war and come to the aid of the Qing. Shanghai was the most decisive loss for the rebels, and the beginning of the end for the Heavenly Kingdom. After almost 11 years of fighting, the tide of war had now decisively turned in favor of the Qing Empire. Zhang Daye had become the official commander of the Loyalist forces, and thanks to the support of the West and reforms on the military, he now found himself leading a more well-equipped, disciplined, and better-funded army. He had developed a strategy of what he called surrounding chess, which involved gradually chipping away at the rebel territory on all sides and slowly tightening the rope around their strongholds. A roadmap towards Tianjin was now underway, and little by little, progress was made. However, there was still a lot of vicious killing ahead. Daye made it clear that few would be spared in his advance. One notorious incident was the massacre of the city of Suzhou, where Daye executed over 40,000 suspected rebels and allowed his troops to indiscriminately rape and loot the civilians, even after they had peacefully surrendered. Similar atrocities by the Loyalist forces occurred frequently all throughout 1862 to 1863. The rebels lost the city of Anqing, depriving them of the coastline. Even then, it didn't matter all that much, as the Westerners refused to sell them vital weapons and supplies, making their war effort hopeless. The Loyalist forces were eventually able to cut their way through rebel territory and drive them out, city by city, town by town. A crucial moment in the war came in November of 1863, when the Loyalists succeeded in conducting an encircling maneuver around Tianjin, surrounding the city. The heavenly capital was completely cut off from food and supplies, and a famine ensued, starving thousands of its inhabitants to death. The famine was so bad that even Hong XiuQuan and his inner circle was affected. XiuQuan had taken to smoking opium, throwing lavish parties, and every night ordered his servants to read passages of the Bible to him. He had become completely detached from reality. With wealth no longer flowing into the city, he was no longer able to engage in the debauchery which he had taken to every day, and for a brief moment was forced to confront the culmination of his actions. The city of his heavenly kingdom was an utter mess. Practically all the ideals of the original god worshippers had vanished. What was meant to be an idealized society to rid the world of evil and generate a utopian theocracy had fallen into a despotic, totalitarian nightmare, one which had been responsible for the deaths of millions upon millions of innocents. After 14 years of struggle, the only thing that had triumphed was madness, delusion, greed, and an unbelievable level of cruelty. The death of Hong XiuQuan is a bit of a mystery. The simplest version of events is that he despaired and committed suicide. However, another narrative tells of how, in order to relieve the famine, he instructed his followers to eat, quote, manna from heaven, which was conveniently found in his garden. He ended up dying of food poisoning after eating some dodgy raw vegetables. Either way, on the 30th of May of 1864, Hong was no more. He was succeeded by his 15-year-old son, Hong XiuQuan, who was hardly much of a leader. The Loyalists had been able to occupy much of the surrounding territory of Tianjin. They most importantly held control of the hills, which allowed them to spy on the city from a distance. However, whilst they had the advantage, the Taiping was still ready to defend their city to the death, and mounting a full assault was deemed unwise. The war instead moved underground, as the besiegers started to dig tunnels in order to plant explosives beneath the city walls. This strategy worked, as on the 19th of July, the Imperial Army successfully detonated a bomb which destroyed a large section of Tianjin's walls. Demoralized, malnourished, outgunned, and outnumbered, the city's defenders were overrun once the assault began. The Loyalists poured through the breach of the wall, and in that moment, all hell broke loose. As Taiping fighters were slaughtered, the whole city was subjected to the worst bloodbath of the war, as civilians of all stripes were rounded up and butchered. Rapes were widespread, and everything which was not bolted to the floor was looted, and within no time, corpses and body parts were littering the streets. Most survivors were often taken and forced into servitude or sexual slavery. This orgy of ultra-violence is estimated to have killed as many as 200,000 people within the span of a single week. The original Nanking Massacre is occasionally compared to the contemporary Nanking Massacre perpetrated by Imperial Japan, but whether or not that is appropriate, I will leave to you to decide. A few survivors were able to escape from the city, most notably Chiang Guifu, the current emperor, and Hong XiuQuan, XiuQuan's cousin. They would end up forming the remnants of the rebellion, which had now been scattered by the Loyalists, and would continue to fight where they could. In that moment, however, the Taiping Rebellion had been defeated. In the immediate aftermath of the rebellion's defeat, China was a broken wreck of a country. Thousands of settlements lay in ruins, entire cities had been destroyed, tens of millions had been displaced and were without a home, its infrastructure was crumbling, its finances were a clusterfudge, and an entire generation had been left traumatized by over a decade of war. Not to mention, practically the entirety of southern China had come under the informal control of Zheng Guofang and his private army, and there was a real concern that he would use this to supplant the very dynasty he had fought to protect. Thankfully, this did not happen, and he willingly disbanded his forces and went back to being a governor. Even then, it was not as if fighting was over. The Taiping renegades, as they came to be called, fled down south back to Guangdong, ironically headed to where the rebellion had originally started. Yet, not many months passed before loyalists giving pursuit managed to capture the main band led by Hong XiuQuan and execute him in October of 1864. Soon afterwards, XiuQuan's son, supposedly God's grandson, was captured and also promptly executed. Still, remnants of the Taiping continued to roam the countryside as bandits or residents of secret hideouts. The last Taiping renegades were finally dealt with in 1871. The Chinese had, in the immediate present, come to despise the Taiping and everything they stood for. One such object of hatred were the Hakka, whose persecution had greatly increased during this age. The Hakka-Punti clan wars are an often forgotten fight that was raging during the rebellion, which saw up to 500,000 Hakkas murdered in a genocidal campaign of ethnic cleansing by the Punti. The Qing government was largely complacent in this atrocity. Meanwhile, there were all the other ongoing rebellions still in China, including the Miao, Hui, and Godog. Even the Nian Rebellion, which had allied with the Taiping, was still ongoing. It was only crushed in 1868 with a similar level of brutality. Soon, another uprising appeared, this time in Xinjiang, the home of the Uyghurs. Yaqub Beg had just led his brethren against Beijing and declared an Islamic Khanate. They were ruthlessly put down, and the Uyghurs have been on the receiving end of a program of ethnic cleansing ever since. After all this, it is frankly a miracle that the Qing dynasty was able to survive for another 50-odd years, although it did not necessarily mean China would benefit much from such a rule. The empire continued to face humiliation and manipulation at the hands of foreigners, being forced to give concession after concession. Several of its provinces became de facto colonies of Western empires, and the opium trade continued to turn the people into useless junkies. A portion of its territory to the north had to be ceded to Russia after it made a threat of invasion. One of its greatest humiliations was the Sino-Japanese War of 1895, where China was forced to give up its influence in Korea. In its late stages, the empire ended up coming under the control of the Dowager Empress Qi, a manipulative and power-hungry woman who, through political maneuvering, was able to use the legitimacy of her son to claim regency to the throne, which she never gave up. Attempts at reform were made on China's woeful stage of development, as practically everyone knew that the country needed to catch up to the West. Yet, the embedded imperial institutions, corruption, and the rejection of the modern world by traditionalists made this impossible. This conflict between progress and modernity culminated in the Box Rebellion of 1898, an uprising of secret societies who claimed to practice traditional martial arts which gave them superhuman powers and invulnerability to bullets. Their aim was to rid China of foreigners and their influence, which drew them to conduct a 55-day siege at the foreign legation's quarter in Beijing. Empress Qi allied herself with them, which ended up being a mistake, as they were promptly defeated when charging headlong into machine gun fire. The foreign powers which had participated in the suppression demanded yet more concessions which China could not refuse. The Qing dynasty was only overthrown in 1911 during the Xinhai Revolution, becoming the last Chinese imperial dynasty after more than 2,000 years of the norm. It was replaced by the Republic of China, although this quickly became a failed state and the country fragmented into warlords. It was only partially united under the general Chiang Kai-shek, who led a repressive and dictatorial regime. China went on to suffer by far its worst humiliation during 1937, which was the invasion by Japan, which killed an estimated 15 million people. Even after that, China's misery wouldn't end, as it fell under the rule of the communists led by Mao Zedong, who became responsible for another 40 million lives lost by a combination of famine, purges, and other atrocities against his own nation. It is honestly quite shocking just how much mass death a single country was able to sustain in the span of a century. There are a few questions I have regarding this chapter of the past. The first is, what is the exact death toll of it all? 20 million is the most common number typically cited. However, the sinister reality is that even that number, as big as it may be, is likely an underestimate. Calculating death tolls in any war is often difficult, and for this war the task is even harder given the chaos which Chinese census data was in at the time, which means extracting an exact number is simply impossible. There is also the difficult issue of classifying what counts as a death. For example, do deaths by famines, which were indirectly caused by fighting, count towards the toll? Most would agree yes, since famines and food shortages are an integral part of war, and therefore the suffering which they cause should be counted. The only way in which we can reach a conclusive number is with population studies, yet these are bound to produce controversies. Several recent studies on the populations of the most affected provinces, conducted within the last few decades, have suggested a death toll as high as 70 million. This number has been contested, but the case remains that many more than just 20 million could have perished. However, even if you just accept the lowest figure, this is still the biggest war of the 19th century and the biggest civil war ever. It's also the biggest war of religion in human history, if you can consider it that. After all, its scale and brutality makes the Crusades look like a pillow fight. This begs my most pressing question. How the hell have so few people ever heard about this? The memory of the Taiping seems to have been completely obscured, even in China. It is quite baffling just how sparse the coverage of this war has been, and just how little it has permeated to the public. Only a few books in English have ever been written about it, the most famous one being God's Chinese Son by Jonathan Spence in 1996, and more recently, Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom by Stephen Platt in 2015, both of which I used in the making of this film. In popular culture, several drama series have been created, the most well-known being the 2007 Warlords, starring Jet Li. However, it is a rather mediocre show, which did not gain a large audience. Interestingly, the acclaimed film The Last Samurai was originally going to be based on the Taiping Rebellion, focusing on the life of Frederick Townsend Ward, the ever-victorious army. However, at the last moment, it was chosen to tell the story of the Satsuma uprising in Japan instead. Chinese historians seem to have mostly focused on other wars in Chinese history, such as the War of the Three Kingdoms in the 3rd century AD, or the An Rebellion in the 8th century. Nevertheless, it did occupy a place in the minds of China in the century that followed, especially amongst revolutionaries. Sun Yat-sen was especially intrigued by them, and saw Hong XiuQuan as a heroic rebel figure trying to liberate the oppressed Han Chinese from their domineering Manchu overlords. Mao Zedong also spoke of them in not too negative terms. In a way, the Taiping were quite similar to Mao's communists, as they were both rebel militant organizations, both sought the abolition of inequality and private property, both were based on foreign ideas, and both had a tendency to throw all logic and common sense out of the window. In the end, however, it seems that a combination of bad luck and disinterest definitely contributed to this chapter of the past being consigned to relative obscurity. However, it is also worth mentioning that as massive and destructive as this war may have been, its overall impact on wider history really hasn't been that significant. The revolutions which we talk about today tend to be the ones which succeeded, not the ones which failed. And had the Taiping actually defeated the Qing dynasty and created a Christian China, it would be the only thing we could possibly talk about in the present. Yet a Christian China right now is only a theoretical concept, which leads me to my final segment. The religion of Christianity in China has had a complex story ever since. In the aftermath of the Taiping, Christian missionaries had a harder time than ever trying to penetrate Chinese society and attract converts, who now viewed the religion with far greater suspicion. Like before, cultural barriers are the greatest impediment to the success of religious propagation, and the conversion rates in the late 19th century were pitiful, despite the enthusiastic efforts of British missionaries. However, they still stubbornly tried to preach the message of the Gospels, and were able to attract pockets of locals for who, whatever reason, felt a certain affinity towards it. The Christian faith in China over time began to develop its own unique and indigenous characteristics. It should be remembered that China is a polyreligious society which has enjoyed the presence of 3 main faiths, that being Taoism, Buddhism, and the philosophy of Confucius, or as he is called in the West, Confucius. It is not within the character of Chinese society to see different religions as mutually exclusive, and do not see a problem in partaking in various religious faiths. Indeed, many Westerners see it as problematic, even heretical, that a Chinese Christian could also be a Confucian, yet this is commonplace here. Christianity experienced a sudden boom during the early 20th century. It was in this age where hundreds of Christian churches and schools were erected all over the country. Exactly why this is not completely clear. However, many have suggested that renewed anti-Manchu and anti-imperial sentiment generated a rekindling of interest in foreign ideals and creeds. Most are unaware of this, but the Chinese Republican movement was strongly influenced by Protestant Christianity. Sun Yat-sen, the leader of the Kuomintang, was a devout Methodist, and so was his successor, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. There was a brief period in its history where it seemed like China would fall under Christianity another way. This, however, did not come to be with the rise of the communists under Mao. The CCP, following the Marxist doctrine that all religion was the opium of the masses, suppressed Christians. The worst period came during the Cultural Revolution, where persecution amplified to extreme levels and the churches of China were temporarily driven underground. Things got better during the period of liberalization under Deng Xiaoping. However, the CCP was maintained by a strictly anti-religion and anti-Christian stance. Persecution has begun to increase once again under the rule of Xi Jinping, as the country lurches towards autocracy. A poll conducted in 2011 by Pew Research showed that there could be as many as 67 million Christians in China, despite the heavy hand from the CCP. If this is true, then it is not far behind the total membership of the CCP itself, which is at around 90 million. With China currently spiraling down the road towards totalitarianism, this statistic certainly poses the question of legitimacy towards the Communist Party, as it only boasts of a membership count that is slightly ahead of a marginalized community. With this in mind, Christians may yet have a role to play in this great and ancient civilization.